but I think that's where a lot of successions mess up is
Yeah.
I'm waiting for this guy to check all of my boxes. I'm passionate about this endeavor, this ministry. And so if he doesn't do that, he's not the guy. He may be needed to focus on something different to take the church to the next level. And so that's really important to recognize.
Welcome back to the Christian Leader Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Franklin, and this is a show where we help you learn and master the skills that you need to grow your leadership effectiveness and enjoyment. And if you don't want to miss an episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell on YouTube or the subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform to get notified as soon as I post a new session. And before I get started, I do want to mention that I have a great product called the Christian Leader Blueprint. It's a solid model for leadership development to help you establish a better rhythm of life, to see yourself more clearly, to leverage your strengths, and to build more productive relationships. And I want to give this short guide to you as my free gift. You can go to ryanfranklin.org and download it today for free. And without any further delay, let's get to our session. I'm excited today to have on the podcast a great friend of mine and a heavy influencer in a lot of areas of my life. His name is Raymond Woodward. And I want to start off by telling you a little bit about him. Raymond Woodward has had over 40 years of pastoral ministry, 30 of them at Capital Community Church in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. First as an assistant pastor for 20 years, and then as a lead pastor for 20 years as well, and 10 years at a different church. He's traveled extensively to teach and preach all over the globe. He currently serves as the UPCI Executive Presbyter for Canada and serves at the Northeast Christian College as the Chancellor. He's been married to Beverly since 1983 and has 2 adult children with 5 grandchildren. And here's what we're here to talk about today. In 2021, he made a major transition from lead pastor at Capital Community Church and now serves as the bishop and the teaching pastor. And so technically, Brother Woodward, I can still call you either Pastor Woodward or now Bishop Woodward. So today I'm gonna settle for Pastor Woodward, if that's okay. And
Good.
I want to welcome you to the Christian Leader Made Simple podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a real honor to join you today on the show. And I'm not really much into titles. When the Bible College in Fredericton asked me to serve as chancellor, I said, just let me go look that up in the dictionary and I'll find out what that actually is. So I'm not much into titles. You can call me whatever. It's a joy to be with you and appreciate you and what you're doing through the podcast to help so many leaders.
Well, thank you so much. And your humility in those titles, or lack of titles, your lack of desire for titles always shows through. You're always such a tremendous person, pleasant person to be around in the many years that I've known you. So let's jump in. You had a unique encounter with who I would consider to be a giant of the faith, Steve Willoughby, and that sort of shaped your vision of leadership transition, particularly pastoral transition. And so can you start off by telling us the story, and maybe for those that don't know who Steve Willoughby is, maybe you can just give a brief summary of who he is or who he was. And so
Absolutely.
Can you start off by telling us that story and what you learned from that experience?
Well, years ago, the first large church I was ever exposed to was Pontiac, Michigan. And my great uncle Leonard Parent started that church. And so I always had kind of a connection to his ministry there, then his son, William Parent. And years ago, so I would have been a very young man, I watched William Parent and Roland Baker do a transition when William was in his 40s, and he was family, so talked with him about it. And then over the years, transition was just something that I was just always an early adopter. I leaned into it, not away from it. And so Steve Willoughby, we first got connected doing some kind of missionary conference and training and ministers conference in Pakistan. And I remember just this almost instant connection. Steve Willoughby and his wife Barbara were great missionaries. I would consider him, in every sense of the biblical word, an apostle to Asia. And the church in Singapore, now pastored by Timothy Lee, it's invested in so many countries. So this is 2010, and Brother Willoughby and I had a connection. I would go to Singapore, been there several times, and he would always kind of sidle up to me somewhere in that meeting, that conference. He did it when we were in Pakistan, the very first time I ever was with him. And he would speak to me prophetically about future and about, this is what I feel God is calling you to do. And that stuff lodged in my heart. Fast forward to 2010, and I was in Singapore. It was after their Deep Calleth Deep conference, and he and Lee Stone King were there, these two giants of the faith, and they're talking. And Brother Willoughby had actually been working on a book that was never published to my knowledge, and it was about pastoral succession. And he was talking all about that subject. And so while these two men are talking, I just grabbed up that unfinished manuscript and just started scrolling through it. And one statement that to me was so powerful was from his eventual successor, Tim Lee, who's a dear friend of mine. And Tim said, the reward of loyalty is empowerment, and the reward of empowerment is loyalty. And Tim has certainly lived that. It's such a great statement.
Pastor Woodward, can you repeat that one more time? That was a powerful quote.
It is a powerful quote. The reward of loyalty is empowerment, and the reward of empowerment is loyalty. So I watched Tim live that. He was so loyal to Brother Willoughby. And so over time, Brother Willoughby empowered him to take lead roles and to eventually become pastor of that church. And the reward of him empowering Tim was more loyalty. And I've observed that in my own life. And so that conversation, it wasn't the beginning of my thoughts on transition, but it kind of accentuated it. And here's why. Just about 9 months before I had that conversation, we had actually voted at CCC for Jack Lehman to become our associate pastor. And in our bylaws, constitutionally, that made him my official successor at whatever time we decided to pull the trigger. So 2010 was kind of a very special year for me on this subject.
Yeah. And I just want to point out, you were only 48 years old when you had that vote, right?
Yep, absolutely.
That is young. I'm 43, so that's 5 years from now.
Yes, sir.
So why so young?
Probably part of it was the influence of Bishop William Parent in my life for so many years, because again, he did their succession in their 40s. But really, I think one of the things, Ryan, that has really impacted me over the years, for the last probably, 15 to 20 years, I have traveled a bunch, been in a lot of mission fields and like yourself, and conferences and different church meetings. And I have seen so many poorly done or really badly done transitions where the church was wounded, the leaders were wounding each other almost.
Yeah.
And I just made up in my mind at an early age, I'm not going to do that. But also, I really bought into something that Steve Willoughby had said to me over and over, that you need to move up, not move aside, not move out, not move down. You need to move up. You need to walk into different roles that God has made for you, because if you don't, you handicap everyone downstream, so to speak, that the people that are following you and are loyal to you, you're not empowering them. And so, yeah, I was an early adopter on succession.
So, a successor was named, but you were not, a time frame was not named, correct?
Exactly. And to be very honest about it, Jack at the time was quite reluctant. Um, I
Uh,
think I pegged him long before he pegged
he
himself
he
for that
wasn't
role.
ready
He
in his
wasn't
mind.
ready.
In his mind,
Nope. I
yeah,
was ready. Actually, we did the constitutional change that would enable that in
yeah.
2006, 5 years after I arrived back at CCC as lead pastor. I would have been ready probably just about any time after that. And not because I was trying to get out of a role, but because I felt a pull to other things. And so that's kind of why we did it that way.
So, what do you? I'm sure that there's some positives, but there's probably also a few negatives, a few cons of planning that early. Can you kind of talk about the pros and cons of planning that early in a
Sure.
ministry?
Well, the biggest pro for us was that our church, I was away, as you mentioned, I was away for 10 years assisting at another church.
Yeah.
Um, During that time, the church, CCC, actually went through a very tragic church situation. The church was divided, and then there were a couple of pastors that came in to kind of try to hold things together. The
Hmm.
second one, who was my immediate predecessor, he died in office of a heart attack at the age of 49. So, in a 5 year
Wow.
span, that church experienced four pastors, and just trauma and drama. And so, when we did the vote on Pastor Jack in 2010, we didn't do the transition for 11 years after that. But I cannot tell you what stability and comfort and peace it brought to that congregation that had been through a trauma, to think we're now set at that point. uh, we're now set for leadership for something like the next 25
That makes
years,
sense. Yeah, that
that we
makes
know
sense.
who's going to be our next pastor. We're watching him raise his kids. We're watching him and his wife. We're listening to him preach. We're watching him lead. And if something happens to Pastor Raymond, we know what the next step is. It's not just kind of thrown to the wolves. So that was the biggest pro. I think the other big pro, Ryan, is that it gives Jack stability. There are so many people I've talked to that they go somewhere, they invest years, they invest energy and prayer and service and effort, and then something changes in the mind of the senior leader, and it's kind of like, it may not even be
Hmm.
overt. It may be kind of subtle, but they suddenly feel like, you know what, I'm not the future here. And I didn't
Yeah,
want to do that to him, because, again, the reward of loyalty is empowerment. So those are the
that's so good.
pros. Cons, I think, um, I'm going to struggle here because really I'm so sold on it. I say I like long ramps in
Yeah.
transitions. I don't like helicopter transitions. We're going to parachute this guy in. He's going to preach for 3 weeks, and then we're going to vote next month. That scares me to death for something as
And
important as the
that's
church
and that is necessary at times,
at
for
times.
because of a death or a bad situation.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
in when there is opportunity to have that long transition, that's what you prefer. And it's not just, I'm hearing you say that particular church, Capital Community Church, um, went through some bad experiences and needed that
Absolutely.
stability. But you would say, even if they had not, you still
I
would
would.
love that long ramp.
I like long ramps. I think it's apostolic. I watch what Paul did with Timothy.
Hmm.
1/3 of the New Testament is either written by Paul to Timothy or by Paul and Timothy. In other words, Timothy's with them. He spent his traveling ministry, which was so considerable, he spent that investing in Timothy, in Titus, in Philemon, and in others who are named in the New Testament. He's constantly investing in the next generation. So we know from history, Timothy ends up, becoming the pastor of Ephesus, the bishop of Ephesus. Why? Because Paul had spent years investing in him and recommending him and commending him to the saints and to the churches. And so I think that's part of my role as a leader, is to not only look at my present responsibilities, that's necessary for any leader, but I think part of my role is to say the kingdom of God is bigger than one leader, it's bigger than one location,
Hmm.
it's bigger than one lifetime, and I want to set that up for the future. That's also part of my responsibility. So, as I said, I struggle to find cons with that.
Yeah,
Perhaps one would be, if any, obvious one, if anything went wrong with the life of that leader that you had selected. But hey, I'm still the leader at that point. So that would
it's
be a
true.
tragedy, but I could deal with it. A con, yes, but it could be dealt with.
That's a good point. Good point. So leading into the next question, I've heard you mention that you consider all pastors to be interim pastors.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Because we all die eventually. Nobody lives forever. The statistics on
Some think they
churches and
will live forever.
some are determined to live forever. The statistics on churches and senior pastors are that 100% of churches will eventually lose their senior leader. Um, and so, yeah, everybody's an interim pastor. And Ryan, I think it's a tragedy that people they lead like it's always going to be me.
Yeah,
Because if you do that, you never develop any other leaders. And I've actually been involved. I think it's probably because of my early adapter status on transition. I've been involved peripherally or even kind of directly in a couple of cases with other transitions and other successions. And I've had the honor of doing succession services and installations of pastors and all of that kind of business. But Ryan, I've been involved in some train wrecks and plane crashes, not directly, but kind of indirectly as counsel to that younger leader. And in some cases, it's like the older leader led right up to a cliff. And then I have to say, it's almost like they didn't care what happened after they were done. And then that younger leader comes in. He's got baggage, he's got problems, he's got issues. And he starts his leadership off with this huge mountain of absolutely needless challenges. And
mm,
so I think we need to consider, I'm an interim pastor. You give us a few decades, and you and I, if the Lord tarries, are both going to be gone. And whoever we've trained is all we've left for leadership after us.
yeah. Just curious if you have an answer for this. What do you think leads to that cliff mentality where it's like, because I've seen that happen as well, where pastors, they just get to the end and then they give out and they just don't. It's like they don't care, and
Yep.
whatever happens to the church at that point is it's up to God and the next immature pastor.
Yeah. I'll give you a direct quote from one situation I dealt with. The senior pastor that was outgoing told his successor, who was, he'd been kind of, it was like the horse and the carrot. It had been held in front of him for years. Someday you're going to be, someday you're going to be. And so I'm having occasional conversations with this young leader, and he's saying, I think I just need to go somewhere else. I thought this was the will of God, but he's not ever going to pull the trigger. And so finally, uh, I get communication from this younger leader. He pulled the trigger, and I'm taking over like next week, and I have to have a board meeting next week. And in that case, the senior leader literally told this young leader, he said, in your first board meeting, a couple of issues you'll need to deal with. Number one, um, we're bankrupt. Number two, we're probably going to lose the building. And he
Oh,
said, why would you do that to me? You wouldn't even say anything. I could have helped. And the
oh
answer
my
was,
goodness.
I wanted to protect my legacy. So in his mind, as long as everything looked good right up to the cliff, we were good. And I think that's so, and I'm not
Wow.
throwing stones here, but that's so egocentric that Raymond
Absolutely.
Woodward is so
Well,
important to CCC.
that's what I wanted to kind of dig into is where does that come from? And you just named it. It's sort of an egotism.
It is.
It's
It
an
is.
egotistical nature, which is sometimes, I hate to admit it, but very common in leadership.
The same positive personality traits that enable a guy like you or me to stand in front of a group of people, preach to them, lead them, challenge them, direct them, the same personality
Yeah.
traits that would enable that. And I'm not talking about a particular color on the personality spectrum. I'm just
Right.
talking about the same boldness, the same confidence in God that would allow you to do that. If it ever switches or it ever becomes self-focused, it becomes a pride or an egotism. And then I'm so confident in me that I think I can do it all forever. And then when my strength finally gives out, or my will to lead because I'm just tired gives out, then I don't care anymore. It was always about me. And I think that's a tragedy.
Yeah, that is a tragedy. And in my mind, I'm thinking, what advice would you give a pastor who is feeling those feelings? But I'm not sure they'd even be listening to this podcast, to be honest with you.
Probably not.
That
You
would
know,
be a what advice
I,
would you give to the younger leader who's sort of dealing with that possibly? I know that's putting
I,
you on the spot with that, but
well, the unfortunately the advice is right, but it's not very comforting.
yeah.
The advice is you've got to get a word from God for your own life. There are
Mm,
a few cases where that younger leader does need to go somewhere else because they're being led off a cliff. And it's not just the church, it's their life, their family, their ministry.
yeah.
But in many cases, Ryan, I would counsel them, you know what? Everybody else is playing checkers with your life. God's playing chess. He can
Yeah.
outwit, he knows everything that's supposed to happen.
So
And
true.
so the passion in a young leader is I got to do it now. I'm getting older. But the reality is God can make up the difference if you'll stay and pray and
Hmm.
kind of, I hate to say bloom where you're planted, but dig into the will of God where you are.
And
Teach Bible studies,
yeah.
disciple people, do all of those things because that's what you're supposed to be doing anyway. You don't need the title to do much of that, and trust God in
Yeah,
the meantime.
that's true. And one thing that, if you don't mind me adding to that, would be to resource from those healthy people around you,
Absolutely.
to find a
Definitely.
friend like Pastor Woodward in your life, or a friend that would be able to sort of coach you through that, mentor you through that,
Yep.
even be a container if you need to vent,
Exactly.
to provide some of those key relational nutrients that we may need in a stressful time like that. But I think it goes back to the fact that God's going to help us through those situations, and we've got to get a word from God.
He will. And sometimes, the brilliant counsel of Woodward to some of these young leaders is, no, you're not. No, you're not leaving. No, you're not going to do
Yeah,
that. Because
right.
they tend to want to do the same thing. They don't want this older leader to just kind of drive them off a cliff, but they're willing to jump off a cliff. Like, okay, it's not going the way I felt, so I'm just going to bail. It's like, no, not right yet. And you're the counselors, the pastors, the leaders, the elders in your life. They'll help you know when it's time to do something different or whether it's time to just wait on God.
Right, right. And so, to be an interim pastor at day one, you're an interim pastor. That takes a lot of humility. Takes uh, a lot of what you naturally exude in your life. And I think, um, sometimes that's going to be difficult for people. Just facing the facts. Sometimes that's going to be difficult to consider themselves an interim in that role. And I guess for those people that it would be extremely difficult for, it would be, um, maybe it's not 48 that they
Sure.
step into that, but maybe, but at least begin looking at it early in life. Get out of the ditch where it's not the cliff
Yeah,
situation,
exactly.
and begin to look at those things early in life. So, were you going to add
I,
something there?
I've said to several of my friends, some of whom are older than I am, and they haven't even thought about this yet. I'm 60 years old. They're in their 60s, and they haven't even given any consideration to who comes after them. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, what's wrong with you? I don't say it that way, but it's like, you've got to start thinking about it, because, Ryan, you and I are spending our lives investing in God's kingdom, in his church, and
Yeah.
specifically in local churches. If we really value that the way we say we do, surely we can value it beyond our own lifetime and beyond our own ministry years. And to
So
me,
true.
it's really
Mm.
high time to think about that. I encourage people that are even in their 50s, if they're the
Yeah.
lead pastor, because if you wait till your 60s, you're going to be talking about maybe a 3-year ramp, a 2-year ramp, and that happens. That's very common. I don't like that. I like long ramps. And the reason is, I've watched it play out at CCC. Ryan, there wasn't a ripple in our church congregation when we did the transition. In fact, you could feel the church almost lean forward in that
That's so good.
transition service. It was time. And I think one of the things, and I'll say this, one of the things is, they weren't afraid that I was going to bail on them.
Mm-hmm.
I was still there. I'm still involved, still active. I'm on the road a bunch, but I'm based out of Fredericton. I'm not planning on going anywhere. I'm there to
You have a
support
few
the pastor.
grandkids back at home that you need
Oh,
to.
yeah, and that makes it really easy to stay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So oftentimes in principles in the New Testament, they're harder to live out than Old Testament principles, primarily in my opinion, because they're not as cut and dry. They're more, a lot of times they're more vague in the approach, and which encompasses more ground than just living by the letter of the law.
Mm-hmm.
You reference a principle in the New Testament that says, he must increase, but I must decrease. John
Mm-hmm.
3:30.
Yep.
Why does it seem that leaders, particularly pastors, struggle with this concept so much? He must increase, but I must decrease.
Ego, pride, self-sufficiency. Sorry to be so blunt. You reference Old Testament and New Testament principles. Old Testament, it's pretty easy. Israel is a physical nation. God gives them physical promises. Keep these laws. I'll protect you. I'll give you the land. I'll take you in. In the Old Testament, we present dead animal sacrifices. That's pretty simple. Slaughter an animal, put it on the altar, burn it up. The New Testament, we're living sacrifices. Living
Right.
sacrifices can crawl down off the altar. And so it's the same thing in that. In the Old Testament, it was so common for a king to come to power, and you read it over and over again, not just in the Bible, but in history, that a king comes to power in ancient times and he slaughters everything of the previous king, his descendants. He undoes his accomplishments. It's crazy. It's like U.S. politics on steroids. It's just terrible. And so that kind of spirit can get into the church almost, where it's about me and my leadership and my desires and obeying me. The reason that principle's hard to live out is because everybody is going to die. Decreasing is harder than dying. So pastors, some of them, their whole attitude is, I'm just going to lead till I die.
Hold on just a second. Decreasing is harder than dying.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
That's
Everybody's going to
a
die. You're going
powerful
to do it
statement.
automatically. It is. But to decrease is intentional. To decrease, you're diminished. To decrease, God has to work on your pride and your tendency, which we all have, to be a little self-centered. So yeah, decreasing is harder than dying. A lot of pastors lead like, I'm just going to lead up till I die. And I've heard them say it, better to wear out than rust out and all of that kind of stuff. But what they're saying is, I'm just going to go till I drop. That's actually fairly easy. What's hard is saying, I'm not the be all and end all here. If I'm not in that role, I still love this church. If I'm not in that role, I'm still going to be prayerful, sacrificial, involved, an example of the believers. I'm going to decrease a little for the younger future to step in, because we see so many transitions where people just have to scramble to pick up the pieces of the
Yeah.
previous pastoral administration, because it was just left either through leaving, through death, sometimes very unfortunately through some kind of moral issue, disability, and now everybody's scrambling, and that actually feels good sometimes in a sadistic kind of way, that look how hard they had to work to replace me. But that's not a kingdom principle.
Yeah.
That's pride.
Yeah. And I would say that just referencing what you had just spoken a few minutes ago, you said you were talking about kingdom vision. If we have a kingdom mindset, a kingdom vision for this church, at some point, if the church is going to continue on, it's going to be without me. And so
Absolutely.
I have to decrease. I have to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Somebody else has to increase in order for there to be. And I wonder at times if that even may be a vision problem of the pastor. A vision problem mixed in with, like you said, an egotistical nature as well.
I think sometimes it is. You said something there, Ryan, and I'm not trying to parse out your words, but you said the kingdom, the church has to go on without me. Um, yes, that's one fact, but the other fact is it has to go on without you or without me in our current roles.
Good
That's
point.
the more difficult thing.
Yeah.
That I'm still here, I still have something to contribute, but I know the timing of the Lord, that I'm supposed to contribute now in a different way, not in the role that I've held for a long time. That's harder than just,
Mm.
it's got to continue without me. We all instinctively know that someday, although we all think we're going to live till forever, but it's going to have to continue if we're going to grow, if we're going to train the next generation of leaders, if we're going to adapt to an ever-changing culture. Then a 60-year-old person like me, I'm not tuned in to the 20-year-olds anymore. I can pretend that I am. I love them with all my heart. I cheer them on. I make a big deal over their babies and their toddlers, and I love them all. But I'm not tuned into where they are in life. So if there's
Yeah.
nobody in there and I'm still doing all the decision making, all the leading, I haven't prepared myself or the church for the future without me in that chair. And that's where we really get into trouble.
Yeah, that's so good. Great point. So you made a successful transition recently at Capital Community Church. Was that in 21 or 22?
21.
21. Okay, so you had the fortitude to say, he must increase, but I must decrease.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me how that went for you as you were sort of approaching that time period and as you moved through it.
It was, and I'm not trying to oversimplify this here, but it was really quite joyous for me. I had taught Jack and his wife Kathy in Bible college. I worked with them in St. John, New Brunswick, that other church that we referenced. I worked with them there for 10 years, and worked with them for 20 years at CCC, now 22 years. So I've worked with Jack in leadership together for 30 years now. And so it was joyful for me to say to the church, and I literally did say this, Ryan. I said, now you know about him what I recognized about him all those years ago. I picked him out of all the students that I ever taught at the Bible college here and said, that's the guy. Jack and I are not the same at all. We're very, very different in personality, and even in abilities. He has different strengths than I do, and vice versa. But there's just something that you know, and you watch him in the church. So it was a joyous feeling. and to watch the church respond to that and be so thrilled with it. It was actually not hard at all, because again, I'm an early adopter. So
Yeah.
I had got myself conditioned to the idea that I'm not going to transition when I'm so old and decrepit that I just can't do this anymore. I want to
Yeah.
transition while I can still have years to be effective in ministry.
That's good. So was, we had mentioned earlier in your bio that you travel extensively around the world. I know in the U.S., every time there's a conference, your name is there. People love you, and so you have the opportunity to be able to travel so much. Did the pastoral leadership sort of gradually shift to his shoulders, or did it land on him that day?
No, it was a very gradual shift, because really Jack had been, certainly for 5 years prior to that, he had
Mm-hmm.
really been handling the day to day, which is
Okay.
exactly what we wanted to do. I wanted to put responsibilities on him gradually, and not overwhelm him all at once. And so that's what we did. In fact, we laugh about it. Most transitions work something like this, that they do the transition, and then the senior guy that's moving on, maybe to a bishop role, he kind of vacates maybe the church, maybe the city for a few weeks, and just kind of gives that younger guy a chance to kind of hook on and lead.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of gone for a bit. Everybody knows he's not like really gone, but he just vacates. Of course, I don't know whether it's the Canadian thing that we're just crazy up there, or our brains are frozen, but we did it exactly backwards and exactly wrong. We've already got a pastor in the senior role that's already traveling. I'm already gone, maybe 2 weekends out of 3 sometimes. And
Yeah.
and so that was already in place. And then we get ready to do the transition. And we did it in 2001, because that was the year, 2021, because that was the year Jack turned 50. And I didn't want to wait longer than that. I felt like I needed to go out about 6 years earlier than 65. And he came in probably 5 years later than 45. And I really felt that was significant. So we get ready to do the transition, and we have a worldwide pandemic, and it shuts down everything. So we just totally blew the normal wisdom out the window. Instead of me kind of being gone, I was home every service for a year and a half, and it still worked because we had such a long ramp leading up to it. It was still wonderful. It didn't bother anybody.
Yeah. You in a letter that you wrote about transition, you quoted Bishop James Carney as saying, the right time for transition is not when the senior leader is ready, but when the successor is ready.
Yes,
and
sir.
I think you just answered that. You were 59 years old, only 59 years old.
Yeah.
Jack was 50.
50.
So what were the signs, besides his age, what were the signs that he was ready? Practical signs, spiritual signs?
By the way, I was in the room when James Carney said that at a conference in Columbia, Mississippi. It was the shot heard round the world when he said that. And I really believe that. Because again, so many people are thinking, well, I'm not ready for transition. I'm not ready to release this. It's not about you. It's about the kingdom. And so Jack was ready spiritually. I believed he was ready a long time before we did the actual transition, or we wouldn't have done the transition. And those signs have to do with not even, so many people look at preaching ability and all kinds of different things that we would think are leadership elements. Bill Hybels, who had his own failing later in leadership, early on, he said something that actually has informed me for years. He said, on a team, you need, in a team person, you need competence. They have to be able to do the job. You need chemistry. In other words, we have to be able to work together. And thirdly, you need character. And here's what he said. And and I was grieved for him and that mega church, Willow Creek, when he had his own failing, because he broke his own rule. He
Yeah.
said, you can train competence, you can work on chemistry, but character, you've either got it or you don't have it. And that's what Jack Lehman had from the moment I saw him as a student in Bible college. He wasn't the greatest preacher. We had other hotshot preachers. Many of them now aren't even in leadership. Some of them aren't even serving God. He wasn't the greatest preacher. He arrived at Bible school and told the leadership there, I don't want to preach. Don't put me on weekend ministry. I'm not a preacher. I'll do whatever else. But his character, and he's a different kind of leader than I am. I'm the kind of leader that I just know what we're supposed to do. And if I could get all these people out of the way, we could do something for God. He's the kind of leader. He's what I call a consensus leader. It's wonderful. He wants everybody's voice at the table. He wants everybody to feel included. So we come at even that from opposite perspectives. But practically, I knew that he was seasoned enough in the eyes of the congregation. They had watched him lead and raise his kids to adulthood and his kids getting married. They had watched him for 20 years. So practically, I just made sure that enough, and this isn't to diminish him in any way, I just made sure that enough boxes were checked. He's not going to check every box that I have checked because we're different.
I'm glad you said that, because sometimes the expectations may be a little too high. And
Absolutely.
I think if you check most of the boxes, particularly those three that are most important,
yes,
then push them out there. Sometimes people can't check the boxes until they get that opportunity.
Because they're not supposed to, Ryan. Those are my boxes.
Yeah.
One of the struggles that Jack and you have to laugh at it. We tell leaders sometimes when we're talking to younger leaders, we've never hit each other. We've talked very loudly and with intensity, and we've had some days when there was an hour or two when we were moody, but we watched their eyes get really big, But one of the things that we talked about, I am a calendar-driven person. I mean, goodness, my life, my calendar is my brain, and so that's how I know. Jack is like, his big line forever was, I'd say, Jack, where's your calendar? Your calendar is my calendar. You tell me what to do. So when we're leading up to the transition, I'm saying, like, Jack, you got to get your own calendar. You're going to be the man. And he still hasn't. And here's why. And he's very much like Pastor at POA, Pastor Mangan. He's not a calendar-driven person. But what he's done is he's pulled other people around, because every leader has gaps of skill. You're never going to have every skill. So Jack never did, still has not checked the calendar box. We actually have had emails back and forth as we're recording this. I'm in Ohio. We've actually had emails back and forth about calendar this week. And I'm not even in that role, but it was just questions about calendar,
So if I ever interview Pastor Lehman, I really need to pay attention to that and remind him often of
you'll get the other side of the story. And you need to get the other side of the story.
I love Pastor Lehman. Tremendous guy.
He's awesome. But he checked all the important boxes. He did not check all of my boxes. And Ryan, I'm belaboring the point, but I think that's where a lot of successions mess up is I'm waiting for this guy to check all of my boxes. I'm passionate about this endeavor, this ministry. And so if he doesn't do that, he's not the guy. He may be needed to focus on something different to take the church to the next level. And so that's really important to recognize.
I love that. Great point to bring that out. So I've heard you teach it at various times, and then I read this the other day on the 6 stages of leadership empowerment. I can't remember where I heard you teach it at, but somewhere. This was 6 stages of leadership empowerment that Jesus used with his disciples. Can you kind of just unpack that briefly?
Sure. First of all, it's not original with me. I can't remember who first said it. I've heard several people say it over the years. But Jesus begins choosing his successors, the apostles, the first week of his earthly ministry.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. He didn't wait till the end.
That is huge.
So it is huge. And so his model is, I do it, and then I do it, and you watch me do it. I do it, and you help me do it. And then he flips it. And you see this in Jesus' life. You also see it in Paul's life. You do it. Now the emphasis is on you, and I'm going to help you do it. You do it, and I'll watch you do it. And finally, you just take it and do it. And I think that's really important. One simple example very quickly from Jack's involvement at CCC is early on, I would handle not a lot of counseling, but sometimes counseling, board meetings, some kinds of visitation when it was necessary. And so I would do it. And then when he came on, within just a very few months, I would take him with me to many of these things because I had in my head, you're the next guy. So I wanted him to at least have access to how I did it, what I did. And so I went and did it. He watched, he came along. And then he would do it. I would be, we'd be in a counseling session. And I'd say, Jack, you take the lead in this session. I'm going to be here. If I need to jump in or you want me to jump in, I'll help. And then finally we flipped it. And I would just be, you do it, Jack, and I'll be there. You do it, and I'll watch. I won't open my mouth, which is hard for a Woodward. And then finally, we're in the stage where he's just doing it. But I think that intentionally flipping of roles, and again, you cannot do that 1 month before you retire. It's impossible. Early adopters, long ramps.
So you have to have a vision for what's to come in order to process that.
Yep.
And honestly, that's just good leadership empowerment, period. I mean, whether it be in any task or any ministry, bring somebody along with you to watch, and then hopefully eventually to do it without you even there. On down the line. So through this process of transition for you out of lead pastor, you formulated 7 succession principles to live out in your leadership. Can you briefly sort of talk through those for us? Do you mind going through those and saying whatever you want to say about them? But I'd like for them to hear the 7 principles.
I'd be glad to do that. I would say that these principles, these really were long before I ever had any role to do a succession. I was not a lead pastor when I committed these to paper and eventually to Facebook, which I call the Great Archive of Apostolic Opinion. So I've put these in writing in different places over the years. I've taught on them. But they actually probably go back even prior to my conversations with Steve Willoughby. But they probably got fleshed out during that time. So number 1, not original with me. I think John Maxwell said this. There is no success without a successor. And I'm so committed to that. You have not succeeded if you abandon your church, if you abandon your ministry, you abandon your post. That is not
It's called
success.
cliff ministry.
We've coined a new term. Now you need to go write the book on cliff ministry, right? You can do it. Secondly, my number 1 job is to reproduce and replace myself. And I think that goes back to that model we just discussed of what Jesus did. I'm trying to reproduce myself, but not in the sense of clones, in the sense of somebody's going to be there for that church that I say I love and I've invested my life in. Somebody's going to be there to replace me. So I want to reproduce, if I can say it this way, I want to reproduce everything that's good in me, in them. But I want to have them have the flexibility to say, but Raymond didn't do this really well. He was really organized. He had that calendar, but he didn't do this part well. So they're a replacement. But I'm going to reproduce as much as I can in them.
Mm-hmm.
Thirdly, the church is not my kingdom. I can't treat it that way. It's not my building. It's not my office. It's not my chair on the platform. The church is not my kingdom. Furthermore, I'm a servant. I'm not a king in the first place. We've got one king in this kingdom, and it's not me. And so that's important. Now,
Very
the
much so.
next two or three, I think, are the crux of what I'm trying to live here. And this has been for years. Number 4 principle, if I always make room for others, God will always make room for me. Ryan, I have lived that. I sometimes will be in a hotel room somewhere. It could be overseas. It could be here in America or somewhere in my home country in Canada. And I think, I get to do this. I don't even know why. I don't think I'm the most capable speaker, certainly far from the most capable leader, but I have a chance to feed into other people and cheer them on as leaders and impact their staff or their team or their volunteers. And I have lived this, that I made room for Jack and I made room for other leaders at home, and God made room for me. He didn't drop me off a cliff.
Right.
Because I didn't drive his church off a cliff. He allowed me to flourish in different areas, and it's been
So good.
very rewarding for me.
That's
Number
so good.
5, so important here, maybe the most important principle of all of these. I will pass the baton while I'm still able to cheer. I don't want to pass the baton when I'm no help to Jack, when I don't have the energy to be involved, when I don't have the strength to be involved. I wanted to pass that baton like a good runner in a relay race. We're still going at full tilt, and we didn't stop, and then he has to pick up this fumbled baton. I want to pass that baton and still have the strength to cheer. And this is not ageism. I'm not taking a shot at anybody here, but I didn't want to be elderly when we did our transition. I wanted to still have things to contribute, not just on the road, but at home. And so I serve as Jack's pastor. I serve as a counsel to him, and if necessary, to the church, if he wanted that for some reason. And so I want to pass that baton young enough. For me, it was 59. I'm so thrilled. I was coming up to 59. I'm 60 now. I'm coming up to 61 this year in just 3 more months, and I'm thrilled. I'm excited. It doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a kingdom gain. Number 6, if I sow, my successor will reap. And that goes all the way back to ego, because some people want to stick around long enough to see the benefit and the harvest and the crop from everything they did. But this is kingdom. And so sometimes I sow into the church. I put a lot of effort and sacrifice and time, but Jack's going to reap that. Maybe somebody even downline from Jack, if the Lord tarries, will reap that. And so I want to sow and allow my successor to reap, and not feel like everything that I've given has to be returned to me during my leadership. And finally, number 7, we've already talked all around this. He must increase, but I must decrease.
So, Pastor Woodward, you are young. You're only 61 years old.
Thank you.
What now? What do you do with your time in ministry? Are you just sitting by the lake fishing, or?
Oh yeah, this is a nice lake. This hotel room is a really nice lake.
What now? What's your role as bishop, as teaching pastor, as whatever? What does the Lord have you doing now?
Again, because I made room for others, I didn't kind of strategize it and try to think, now where am I going to fit? I'm probably busier than I've ever been. I'm freer to travel now, although I'm probably at the age where I'm trying to travel a little judiciously. I want to be part of my grandkids' lives. Certainly want to be there for Beverly and even Jack and the church. So post-COVID, travel has been really, really busy because I was off the road for 1.5 years. But looking ahead, I want to take time to write some things, I want to take time to just kind of work with younger leaders, and I have such a privilege to do that in many settings. I'm actually kind of a little um, apostolic troubleshooter. I actually get called in when things do blow up in a church or sometimes even a wider setting. And so I have, even some superintendents that call me, not because I'm so smart or whatever, but I'm available. And, so that kind of ministry is wonderful. Helping pastors sometimes negotiate doctrinal attacks on their church or in their district. And so there's lots to do. This is the kingdom. It's bigger than me or
Yeah.
you, Ryan. It's bigger than POA or CCC. And so we just plug in where we can, and it's so rewarding. And the last thing I would say on that is right now, I'm in the cheering section. I'm cheering Jack on, cheering CCC on, cheering the other leaders that are there, including my son Matthew. So I'm young enough to still cheer, and that's a beautiful thing.
That is a beautiful thing. And I hear such a balance in your voice. You're not retired by any means.
Yeah.
But you're also, you have margin. You have time for your kids. I was joking about the lake, but I would hope that you're spending some time by the lake, and there's something to that balance and that rhythm of life that will sustain you for into your 70s and
Absolutely.
80s, and
Yep.
as long as you
Keep
can
going.
continue to do ministry, 90s,
There
100s.
you go.
So
It's really important, Ryan. I love everything that we do. I love the work of God, and I'm just thrilled to be involved in it. It's a privilege.
absolutely. So one last question I ask all of the people that I interview, this question. It can be related to our topic of transition here, or it could be something completely different. What's one thing that you wish you could tell your younger self?
Let me answer that, and because you're talking to a long-winded friend, I want to make one more comment just after that. So first of
Okay.
all, to my younger self, I would say concentrate on your personal relationship with God,
Mm.
and don't get so busy, because I'm a type A, push, drive, go, plan, strategize. Concentrate on your personal relationship with God and not just all the things that you're doing for God. That's
That's
so
good.
very important. That's the number one thing I would say to my younger self, because at one point I was working at a church. I had two part-time jobs to support my family because that wasn't a highly paid position at the time. And it was just such a busy, busy time. And so
Yeah.
that's what I would say to my younger self. But I would like to just kind of say, to all of the people that are listening and they're thinking, I don't know that I could do that succession or that transition, certainly not that early. I'm just concerned about it. I don't know that I could do it. I had always said to the guys at home, to Jack, to Matt, to the other ministers, some friends that I'd talked to, they talked about the traveling thing. Well, you're okay for succession because you're traveling all the time. You've got something to do. So of course you could transition the church. And I had always said to Jack and to other guys at home, if this travel all shut down tomorrow, it is not who I am. It's just what I get to do for God. So if it all shut down tomorrow, I would be just as happy. I would spend time with Beverly and the kids, and I just lock into the church here. I don't need to travel to be happy
Hmm.
or content or fulfilled. Well, Ryan, the world shut down in March of 2020, and I had the opportunity to prove exactly that because I was home for a solid year and a half
Wow.
because of the COVID restrictions. And I can tell you, and the guys at home can tell you, I didn't get moody. I didn't miss anything. I wasn't on social media, kind of looking at all the conferences that I had to miss because I couldn't travel across the border. I just locked into church at home. And I think that's the
Mm.
most important thing that you and I could say to leaders is dig into what you're doing for God, not who you are, not your role, not your position. This is
So
about
good.
kingdom. And if you're content in God, you'll be content in whatever place of service that he gives you.
That's so good. So good. Well, Pastor Woodward, this has been tremendous, and I know it's going to help a lot of people. Thank you so much. I know you're a very, very busy man, and you've given us a lot of your time today, and it's been such a pleasure to have you on. If people want to connect with you in some way, what would you recommend, maybe to follow you on social media? What would you recommend for them?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, but really I do most anything I post on Facebook. So I'm there.
Okay.
Sermons, the church has a YouTube channel, capitalcommunity.tv. That's where all of our services and sermons are. And then I've got a personal website, raymondwoodward.com, and there's sermon notes and resources, that kind of stuff. So they're welcome to connect anyway like that.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely put those links in the show notes for people. I do want to mention, though, and every now and then I will go to your website, raymondwoodward.com. There is a wealth of resources on that website. If you have never visited that, if you're listening to this and you have never visited raymondwoodward.com, go visit. There is a wealth of messages, downloads. You could be selling this stuff, making thousands and thousands of dollars, but you give it away for free. And that's just amazing to me. And
well, thank
hats
you,
off to you for what you do there.
Well, while they're doing that and visiting raymondwoodward.com, they need to visit ryanfranklin.org as well. I would recommend that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So if you're a new listener, I just want to encourage you, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to audio podcast or on YouTube. And also, it would just make my day if you would take a minute, go and rate the show and write a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. My name is Ryan Franklin. Thank you so much for joining us on the Christian Leader Made Simple podcast.